The restaurant buzzed with quiet conversations, the clinking of silverware against plates, and the occasional burst of laughter from nearby tables, all blending together into an elegant but impersonal backdrop. I had chosen this place for my birthday dinner because it was refined, upscale, the kind of place where I wouldn't have to worry about my family's usual nonsense turning into a full-blown spectacle. But deep down, I knew better than to think I could avoid it completely because it was always the same story every year, no matter how much effort I put into making the evening feel normal. I could already sense what was coming the moment we sat down, the way my parents exchanged knowing glances when the waiter handed me the wine list first, as if they were amused by the idea that I would be the one making the decisions for the night. My father, ever the master of backhanded compliments, had started off strong by remarking on how impressive it was that I had managed to book a reservation here, considering that not everyone in the family has the same pull. I had brushed it off with a tight smile, sipping my drink and reminding myself that this was just how things had always been. Jessica, my younger sister, had been the golden child from the moment she was born, and I had spent my entire life playing second place in a competition I never signed up for. As the waiter took our orders and the small talk droned on, I could feel the inevitable moment creeping closer, the part of the evening where my accomplishments would be glossed over in favor of rehashing my sister's latest achievements, whether real or exaggerated. It always started subtly, with my mother gushing about some new charity event Jessica had attended or the latest expensive vacation she had taken, framing it as casual conversation but ensuring the message was clear. Jessica was thriving, succeeding, living a life that everyone admired, while I was just here. And then, just as I had expected, my father leaned back in his chair, swirling his drink in his hand before letting out a chuckle that sent a wave of secondhand embarrassment through my body before he even spoke. "We all know Jessica is the real success in the family," he said, his voice dripping with amusement, as if he had just made an innocent joke rather than a statement I had heard in 100 different variations over the years. The table laughed, nodding along like it was some long-established fact, an undeniable truth that no one felt the need to question. I felt my jaw tighten, my fingers curling slightly against the tablecloth, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral, unaffected, because I had learned long ago that reacting would only make it worse. Jessica, sitting across from me in her effortlessly perfect designer dress, simply smiled, basking in the attention like she always did, never once stopping to consider how those words might feel on the other end. But then, something happened that none of us expected. A low chuckle came from the other end of the table, a voice that didn't belong to my family but to my
Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
boss, who had been sitting quietly until now, sipping his drink and observing the entire exchange with mild amusement. "That's funny," he said casually, setting his glass down and glancing toward Jessica with a smirk that instantly made my stomach tighten. Because she just asked me for a job. For the first time in forever, the room went silent. Jessica's smile froze, her fingers tightening slightly around her fork as her carefully composed expression cracked for the briefest second, a flicker of something that looked dangerously close to panic flashing across her face. My father, still mid-laugh, stiffened, the amusement draining from his features as he processed what had just been said. My mother blinked, as if trying to piece together a puzzle that didn't make sense, because in their minds, Jessica didn't need a job. Jessica was successful, accomplished, effortlessly thriving in a way that required no explanation. And yet, here was my boss, someone completely removed from our family dynamic, someone with no reason to lie, revealing a truth that none of them had been prepared to hear. I watched as Jessica quickly composed herself, forcing out a soft laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes, shaking her head as if my boss had simply misunderstood something. "Oh, that," she said lightly, waving a hand dismissively, but I could see the way her fingers trembled ever so slightly. "That wasn't serious. I was just curious about the industry, that's all."
I didn't buy it.
And judging by the way my boss simply raised an eyebrow, neither did he. The tension at the table was suffocating now, a stark contrast to the smug atmosphere that had filled the room just minutes before. My father cleared his throat, trying to regain control of the situation, but I saw the uncertainty in his eyes, the way he was suddenly second-guessing the narrative he had spent years building. For the first time in my life, Jessica wasn't untouchable. For the first time, I had witnessed her carefully curated image slip, even if just for a moment, and I wasn't about to let it go unnoticed. So I sat back, took a slow sip of my wine, and smiled. Because this was going to be fun. The uncomfortable silence that followed my boss's casual revelation stretched so thick across the table that I could almost hear the weight of it pressing down on everyone's shoulders, a suffocating force that none of them knew how to escape. Jessica, always so composed, always so effortlessly in control of any social situation, forced out another laugh that was just a little too high-pitched, just a little too airy, as if she was trying to wave away the moment like it had never happened. I watched her closely, noticing the way she tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the way she quickly glanced toward my father as if searching for reassurance, the way her fingers gripped the stem of her wine glass just a little too tightly, like she was holding on for dear life. My father, who had spent my entire life singing Jessica's praises as though she had walked straight out of a success story designed to shame me by comparison, finally cleared his throat and leaned back in his chair, forcing a strange chuckle that didn't quite mask the tension in his voice. "Oh, come on," he said, waving a dismissive hand as if the entire thing was nothing more than a misunderstanding, his eyes darting toward my boss with an expression that was just a little too sharp. Jessica doesn't need a job, not when she's got everything already figured out. She was probably just networking. You know how young professionals are these days, always looking to make connections. Jessica jumped on that explanation so quickly it was almost laughable, nodding her head so fast I was surprised she didn't give herself whiplash. "Exactly," she said, her voice just a touch too eager, her perfectly manicured nails tapping lightly against the table, as if she were trying to appear casual. "I mean, I wasn't actually looking for a job, I was just curious about the industry, and I figured it wouldn't hurt to ask a few questions." My boss, still completely unaware that he had just cracked open a foundation of lies that had been carefully cemented for years, simply shrugged, taking another sip of his drink before setting it down with a smirk. "That's funny," he mused, tilting his head slightly as if trying to recall the conversation. "Because you didn't seem just curious when you asked if there were any openings and said you'd be willing to start immediately." The table might as well have imploded. Jessica's face tightened, the color draining from her cheeks so fast that even the dim lighting of the restaurant couldn't hide it. My father, who had spent years treating her like the infallible daughter who could do no wrong, looked like someone had just poured a bucket of ice water over his head, his jaw clenching as he stared at her, as if he was trying to figure out why this didn't fit the perfect image he had built of her in his head. My mother, ever the peacemaker, quickly jumped in, her voice light and overly sweet, the kind of tone she always used when she was trying to pretend everything was fine even when it was very clearly falling apart. "Oh, well, I'm sure there was some misunderstanding," she said, forcing a small laugh as she reached for her wine glass, taking a long sip before glancing at Jessica with the same gentle, protective expression she had never once given me. "Jessica probably wasn't serious, right, sweetheart?" Jessica nodded so quickly that I was sure she was mentally calculating how to spin the story before the night was over. "Right, exactly," she said, the words coming out too smooth, too rehearsed, like she was desperately trying to gain back control of the narrative before it slipped completely through her fingers. "It was just a casual conversation, nothing serious. You know how things get exaggerated sometimes." I said nothing, just let my gaze linger on her for a second too long, because I had seen something. For just a fraction of a second, when my boss had spoken, Jessica had panicked. And not just the kind of embarrassment that came from being caught in an awkward situation, not just the mild discomfort of being the center of attention. No, this was something deeper, something raw, something that looked dangerously close to fear. Jessica was hiding something. And for the first time in my life, I had the upper hand. The rest of the dinner passed in a haze of forced small talk, my parents doing their best to steer the conversation away from what had just happened, Jessica regaining enough composure to flash her usual charming smile, laughing at all the right moments, pretending that nothing had shifted. But I wasn't fooled, not even for a second, And as we said our goodbyes at the end of the night, as I watched Jessica hug our parents before slipping into her car with a little too much urgency, I made a decision. I needed to find out the truth. The next morning, with my coffee in one hand and my laptop open in front of me, I started digging, something I had never bothered to do before because I had always believed that Jessica really did have it all. I searched her name, went through her company's website, looked up every piece of information I could find about the career she had always boasted about, the picture-perfect life she flaunted across social media. But the deeper I went, the more the inconsistencies started piling up, little details that didn't quite add up, tiny cracks in the story that I had never noticed before. Her job title had changed 3 times in the last year, a red flag that suggested instability rather than the success she always bragged about. Her LinkedIn was oddly vague, lacking the specifics that most professionals in her field would include. Her Instagram, which had always been filled with luxury vacations, high-end shopping sprees, and extravagant dinners, suddenly seemed a little too curated, too performative, too desperate to prove something. And then I found it. A small, buried article from a local business journal, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly what to look for. Jessica's former company had undergone mass layoffs months ago, cutting nearly half of their senior staff, including several department heads. Jessica's name was on the list. She had lost her job, and she hadn't told a single soul. I leaned back in my chair, exhaling slowly as the realization settled over me, the pieces snapping into place so clearly now that I was finally seeing it for what it was. Jessica had been lying for months, and now I had the perfect opportunity to expose her. I sat in front of my laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating my face in the dim light of my apartment, my fingers resting lightly against the keyboard as I processed what I had just discovered. My sister, the so-called perfect one, the golden child who had spent her entire life looking down on me, had been unemployed for months and hadn't told a single soul. I could hardly believe it, not because I thought she was incapable of failure, but because I had never once seen her without a carefully crafted, flawless persona that made her seem untouchable. But now that I knew the truth, I wasn't about to stop there. Something about this entire situation didn't sit right with me, not just the fact that she had been lying, but the way she had desperately tried to cover it up at dinner, the sheer panic that had flashed across her face when she realized her secret had slipped through the cracks. If she had simply been between jobs, it wouldn't have been such a big deal, but the way she had reacted told me there was more to the story, something deeper, something she was terrified of anyone finding out. So I kept digging. I started searching for anything connected to her name, business records, financial documents, anything that might explain why she was clinging so hard to the illusion of success. It didn't take long before I found something that made my stomach tighten. There, buried in legal notices and financial reports, were documents that I knew my parents had never seen. Jessica was drowning in debt. Credit card balances that had skyrocketed into 6-figure territory, multiple missed payments, warnings of collections, and even a quiet foreclosure notice on a condo she had allegedly purchased in full years ago. Everything she had presented as her reality, the expensive vacations, the designer shopping sprees, the first-class flights and luxury living, had been nothing more than a crumbling house of cards held together by a combination of arrogance and sheer desperation. I exhaled slowly, my heart pounding in my chest, not because I felt bad for her, but because I realized just how deeply I had been deceived, how my entire family had been deceived, how Jessica had let our parents keep believing she was the golden child while watching them dismiss me over and over again. I thought back to every dinner where I had been subtly compared to her, every moment where my accomplishments had been glossed over in favor of celebrating her latest achievement, every time my parents had rolled their eyes when I mentioned something I was proud of, every single time they had made me feel like I was somehow lesser. And all this time, while I had been working hard, pushing through challenges, actually building something real for myself, Jessica had been faking it, spending money she didn't have, and feeding everyone a lie that they had eagerly swallowed without a second thought. It wasn't just anger that filled me. It was resentment, years of it, a slow-burning fire that had finally reached the point of no return. And I wasn't about to let this go. The first time I saw Jessica after the dinner, It was at my parents' house for a casual Sunday lunch, the kind of gathering where my mother made too much food. My father spent the entire time talking about his golf game, and Jessica sat in the center of it all, soaking up the attention like it was her birthright. But this time, something was different. Jessica was off. She was too quiet, too tense, too hyper-aware of my presence in a way she had never been before. Normally, she would have dominated the conversation effortlessly, making sure everyone knew about her latest successes, but now, she was carefully avoiding me, acting as if she was afraid I would say something that would send everything crashing down. I watched her closely, studied every move she made, every forced laugh, every flicker of discomfort, and that was when I knew I had her exactly where I wanted her. So, I decided to push her. I leaned back in my chair, swirling my drink in my hand, keeping my tone casual as I said, "Oh, by the way, Jessica, I ran into someone the other day who mentioned your big project at work. What was it called again?" I could feel the tension snap into place like a wire pulled too tight, the way Jessica froze for just a fraction of a second before forcing out a quick smile. "Oh," she said, barely missing a beat. "I've been working on so many things lately, hard to keep track." My parents, as expected, ate up the response like it was gospel, nodding in approval, smiling proudly, completely unaware that she was lying right to their faces. But I knew better, because I had made the whole thing up. There was no project. There was no big work event. I had thrown a lie into the conversation just to see how she would react, and she had taken the bait without hesitation, proving exactly what I had suspected. Jessica was still trying to keep up the act, still pretending, still scrambling to maintain control of the narrative before it slipped from her hands completely. And the best part? She had no idea that I already knew the truth. I sat back, smiling to myself, knowing that this was only the beginning. Jessica had always been a master of deception, someone who could spin reality into whatever version best suited her at any given moment, a woman who had spent years crafting a narrative so flawless that no one in our family had ever dared to question it. But now, with the cracks beginning to spread, with her carefully constructed empire teetering on the edge of collapse, I could see the telltale signs of desperation creeping in, the forced laughter, the nervous glances, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly whenever she thought no one was looking. She was unraveling right in front of me, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't the one on the receiving end of the scrutiny. The day after I had planted the false story about her big project at work, I received a text from my mother, gushing about how proud she was of Jessica for leading such an important initiative. I could hardly contain my amusement as I read the message, knowing that Jessica had immediately taken my bait and run with it, feeding my parents a completely fabricated success story rather than admit she had nothing. I decided to push her even further. At our next family gathering, a casual dinner at my parents' house, I sat across from Jessica at the dining table, watching as she meticulously cut her food into tiny, precise bites, her usual carefree demeanor replaced by something noticeably stiffer. She knew I was watching her, knew I had seen something she desperately wished I hadn't, and now, it was only a matter of time before the walls closed in completely. "So, Jessica," I said, keeping my tone as light as possible, feigning innocent curiosity while twirling the stem of my wine glass between my fingers. "Mom was telling me about that project you're leading. I'd love to hear more about it." For just a fraction of a second, she froze. It was quick, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. The tightening of her jaw, the way her shoulders tensed before she forced herself to relax, the flicker of sheer panic in her eyes before she pasted on that practiced smile. "Oh, it's nothing too exciting," she said, reaching for her glass as if the movement would somehow steady her. "Just a lot of moving parts. You know how corporate life is, always a million things happening at once." I nodded slowly, watching as she fidgeted under my gaze, struggling to maintain the illusion when I knew for a fact there was nothing behind it. "Must be tough balancing that with everything else going on," I added casually, dropping just enough of a vague hint to see if she would squirm.
She did.
Jessica let out a small, nervous laugh, waving a hand dismissively. "Oh, you know me, I always manage," she said, but there was something off about the way she said it, Something too eager, too rehearsed, like she was desperately trying to convince both herself and everyone else at the table that she still had control. Our parents, as expected, nodded along, completely oblivious to the mounting tension between us, too blinded by their unwavering faith in Jessica's perfection to even entertain the thought that something might be wrong. I had spent my entire life fighting for their recognition, trying to prove that I was worth just as much as Jessica, but now, for the first time, I didn't need their validation. Because I knew the truth. And she knew that I knew. But Jessica wasn't going to go down without a fight. A few days later, as I sat at my desk preparing for an important presentation at work, an email popped up in my inbox from a senior executive, congratulating me on a proposal I had supposedly collaborated on with Jessica. Except I hadn't. My stomach dropped as I clicked on the attached document, scanning the contents with growing fury, my hands tightening into fists as I realized what she had done. Jessica, in her desperate attempt to regain control, had stolen one of my work projects, slapped her name onto it, and somehow passed it off as a joint effort, spinning yet another lie to maintain the illusion of her unstoppable success. I exhaled slowly, fighting the immediate urge to call her and tear into her right then and there. But as my initial anger began to settle, a realization crept in, one that made me lean back in my chair with a slow, knowing smirk. Jessica was playing defense now. She was scrambling, reacting instead of planning, making sloppy mistakes because she knew the walls were closing in on her. And instead of confronting her immediately, instead of giving her the satisfaction of seeing me lose my temper, I decided to do something else. I let it happen. For now. Because I knew something Jessica didn't. I had already found proof that she had committed fraud. It had started as a simple curiosity, a need to understand just how deep her financial troubles ran, but as I had dug deeper into her records, I had found something far worse than maxed-out credit cards and missed payments. Jessica had been falsifying financial documents, lying about her income to secure loans, forging signatures on contracts that she had no business signing. She hadn't just been reckless, she had been committing crimes, and she had done it all under the assumption that she was too smart to ever get caught. But now, I had everything I needed to destroy her. I sat there for a long moment, staring at my computer screen, feeling the weight of the decision ahead of me. I could expose her right now, shatter the illusion, rip away the mask she had spent years perfecting. Or I could wait, because the higher she tried to climb, the harder she was going to fall. And I wanted to make sure she felt every single second of it. Jessica had spent years perfecting the art of deception, spinning illusions so seamlessly that even our own parents had never stopped to question whether her success was real or simply an elaborate performance held together by arrogance and borrowed time. But now, as I sat in my apartment staring at the incriminating evidence I had gathered, I knew she had finally met her match, because unlike the people she had fooled for so long, I had no intention of letting her slip away without consequences. I had spent my entire life being compared to her, treated like the lesser sibling, forced into the background while she basked in the spotlight, but now the tables had turned, and for the first time, I was the one holding all the power. I wasn't going to rush this. Jessica had spent years building her reputation, carefully crafting the image of the perfect daughter, the accomplished professional, the golden child who could do no wrong, and if I wanted to bring her down, I had to do it in a way that left no room for her to twist the truth, no space for her to manipulate the situation to her advantage. If I confronted her outright, she would find a way to talk her way out of it, turning herself into the victim, painting me as bitter and jealous, just like she always did. But if I played this right, if I set the stage carefully enough, if I let her own lies collapse in on her, there would be nothing left for her to hide behind. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I expected. A few days later, my mother called, her voice filled with the usual forced cheerfulness that always signaled she was about to ask for something. "We're having a family dinner next weekend," she said, as if it was some spontaneous event and not something she and my father had likely planned after hearing Jessica's latest exaggerated success story. "I think it would be nice for everyone to catch up, don't you?" I could hear the unspoken message beneath her words. She wanted me to come, but not because she missed me. She wanted me there so I could sit at the table and listen to another night of praise for Jessica, another evening spent nodding along as my parents gushed over a daughter who had been lying to their faces for months. I almost laughed at the irony of it. Because this time, the family dinner wouldn't be another tribute to Jessica's false perfection. This time, it would be the beginning of her downfall. I agreed to come, keeping my voice light, pretending I had no idea what was about to unfold, and as soon as I hung up, I started putting the pieces into place. Jessica had been avoiding me since our last encounter, dodging questions, keeping her answers vague, and refusing to meet my eyes whenever we were in the same room. She knew that I had seen something, felt the shift in control, sensed that I was no longer playing my usual role as the overlooked sister. But she had no idea what I actually knew. So, I decided to make her sweat. A few days before the dinner, I leaked a small piece of damaging information anonymously, just enough to rattle her, just enough to make her wonder who was watching. It wasn't a direct accusation, nothing that could be traced back to me, but it was enough to start the fire. A subtle email sent to a few people at her old company, a quiet whisper on a professional forum about fraudulent reports, an anonymous tip to a financial blog that specialized in corporate scandals. It was a seed, a carefully placed crack in the perfect image she had built, something that would start small but grow uncontrollably once the right people started asking questions. And I knew, without a doubt, that Jessica would immediately realize something was wrong. Because for the first time, she wasn't the one in control of the story. And by the time the family dinner arrived, she would be desperate enough to make a mistake. The moment I stepped through the front door of my parents' house, I could feel it in the air, the tension, thick and suffocating, clinging to every surface like an invisible fog. The usual warmth of family gatherings, the easy laughter, the forced but familiar routine of catching up on trivial things, all of it was missing, replaced by an underlying unease that no one wanted to acknowledge just yet. I knew exactly why. By now, the whispers had already started. Jessica's carefully crafted persona was beginning to crack, and no amount of charm, no amount of perfectly rehearsed smiles, could keep the truth from leaking out. The anonymous information I had planted had done exactly what I intended. It had set off a quiet but growing storm, one that Jessica was desperately trying to contain before it swallowed her whole. As I made my way toward the dining room, I caught sight of her standing near the kitchen island, wine glass in hand, nodding along absent-mindedly as my mother spoke, but even from a distance, I could see it. The stiff shoulders, the distracted glances, the way her grip on the glass was just a little too tight. She was unraveling. And tonight, in front of everyone, I was going to let her fall apart completely. I took my seat at the dinner table, watching as Jessica sat directly across from me, her movements practiced, controlled, as if she were willing herself to behave as if nothing was wrong. But there was something different about her tonight, something off, something missing, something that told me she was barely holding on. Dinner started as it always did, my parents leading the conversation, talking about mundane things, asking predictable questions about work, life, and plans for the future. But underneath it all, there was an unspoken weight to the conversation, a tension that grew with every passing second, because we all knew something was off, even if no one was ready to say it out loud just yet. And then, as if on cue, my uncle, always the one to say things without thinking, dropped the first crack into Jessica's illusion. "I heard something interesting the other day," he said casually, reaching for the breadbasket as if he wasn't about to detonate a bomb in the middle of the dinner table. "Someone mentioned there's been a bit of a scandal with layoffs at Jessica's old company. Lots of financial problems, bad investments, people losing their jobs left and right. Crazy, huh?" Jessica's entire body went rigid. For the first time all night, her practiced mask slipped, just for a second, just long enough for me to catch the flicker of panic in her eyes before she forced a quick smile. "Oh," she said lightly, her voice a little too airy, a little too casual. "Yeah, I heard about that too. Terrible situation. But, I left that company a while ago, so none of that really affected me." She said it so smoothly, so effortlessly, that I almost laughed, because I knew she was lying, knew she had just fed them the exact narrative she had rehearsed in her head 100 times, knowing that our parents would accept whatever she told them without question. And maybe they would have, if I hadn't been there. I took a slow sip of my wine, setting the glass down carefully before leaning forward just slightly, just enough to make her uncomfortable without making it obvious to everyone else. "Are you sure about that?" I asked, my tone light, almost curious, as if I were just making casual conversation. "Because I could have sworn I saw your name on the list of people who were let go." The table went silent. Jessica blinked. She didn't speak immediately, didn't react right away, and that hesitation, that fraction of a second where she was caught completely off guard, told me everything I needed to know. My mother frowned, looking between us, confusion written all over her face. "Jessica," she said, her voice uncertain, a crack forming in the blind faith she had always placed in her perfect daughter. "That can't be right. You never mentioned anything about that." Jessica recovered quickly, letting out a soft, forced laugh, shaking her head as if the very idea was absurd. "Of course, that's not true," she said smoothly, her voice regaining some of its confidence. But now there was something forced about it, something just a little too rehearsed, a little too eager. I let her sit in the lie for just a few more seconds, watching as she desperately tried to gauge whether I was bluffing, whether I was actually holding anything that could prove her wrong. And then I pulled out my phone. With a few taps, I brought up the article I had found weeks ago, the one listing all the employees who had been let go, the one that had Jessica's name printed clearly among them. I turned the screen toward the table, setting it down in the center where everyone could see. "I don't know," I said lightly, my voice calm, controlled, almost amused. "This looks pretty official to me." Jessica's entire face drained of color. The reaction was immediate, the shift in energy at the table so sharp, so sudden, that I could almost feel the moment her entire charade collapsed in on itself. My father, usually the first to jump to her defense, stared at the screen with narrowed eyes, his expression unreadable, while my mother's hand went to her mouth, her entire posture tense, rigid. Jessica opened her mouth, then closed it again. For the first time in her life, she had no idea what to say. I sat back, watching the realization settle over everyone, watching as my parents, who had spent their entire lives believing that Jessica could do no wrong, suddenly had to question everything they thought they knew. And then, in one last, desperate move, Jessica did exactly what I'd been waiting for her to do.
She turned the blame onto me.
"This is ridiculous," she said quickly, her voice sharper now, more desperate, her gaze locking onto mine with pure hostility. "I don't know why Emily is so obsessed with tearing me down, but this is just sad. I mean, seriously, are you that jealous of me?" It was an old tactic, one she had used countless times before, painting me as bitter, insecure, desperate to bring her down because I could never measure up. But this time no one was buying it, because the proof was right there. And for the first time, Jessica was out of lies. The silence at the dinner table was suffocating, thick and heavy like a dense fog that had settled over the room, making it impossible to pretend that everything was still normal. Jessica sat stiffly in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the table so tightly that her knuckles turned white, her face a shade paler than I had ever seen it before. She knew she was cornered, knew she had just been caught in a lie so blatant that even our parents couldn't ignore it, and for the first time in her life, she didn't have a quick escape. I could see her mind working, see the calculations happening in real time, the way her eyes flicked between our father's furrowed brow and our mother's stunned expression, searching for an angle, a way out, an excuse that might be enough to salvage what was left of her carefully crafted image. And then, right on cue, she did what she had always done best. She played the victim. "Oh my God," she breathed, forcing out a laugh that was meant to sound amused but came out choked, unnatural, barely masking the sheer panic behind it. "I cannot believe this. I mean, really, Emily? You're seriously going this far just to make me look bad?" I didn't say anything, just stared at her, letting the moment stretch, letting the weight of her own words settle over the table, because we both knew exactly what she was doing. Jessica had been manipulating situations her entire life, spinning stories so that she was always the one being wronged, always the one people felt the need to defend. And for years, it had worked. Our parents had fallen for it every single time, never questioning whether she was actually telling the truth or just saying whatever was necessary to protect herself. But this time, it wasn't going to work. "Jessica," I said, keeping my voice calm, measured, careful not to give her the emotional reaction she was baiting me for. "No one is making you look bad. You did that all on your own." She scoffed, rolling her eyes as she leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms over her chest in a show of defiance. "Oh, please," she said, shaking her head, forcing a smirk that didn't quite reach her eyes. "You've been jealous of me since we were kids, and now what? You're trying to get back at me because Mom and Dad actually like me?" I almost laughed at the sheer audacity of it, at the way she was still clinging to the same tired script, still acting as if she had any control left. But I didn't laugh.
I didn't react.
Because that's what she wanted, and I wasn't going to give it to her. I reached for my phone, tapping the screen to bring up the document I had saved, the one that held undeniable proof of everything I had found. The layoff notices, the financial records, the fraudulent loan applications, all of it neatly compiled, a paper trail that she couldn't explain away. I slid the phone across the table, watching as it stopped right in front of her plate, her name printed clearly on every single line. "Tell me, Jessica," I said, tilting my head slightly, watching her face carefully, "am I still just making things up?" For a moment, she didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't even blink. I could see the truth sinking in, the realization that this wasn't just a small slip-up she could talk her way out of, that I hadn't come to this dinner with suspicions. I had come with evidence. Our mother let out a sharp inhale, her hands shaking as she reached for the phone, her eyes scanning the documents, her expression shifting from confusion to shock to something dangerously close to heartbreak. Our father sat motionless, staring at Jessica, his face unreadable, but his silence far louder than anything he could have said. "Jessica," my mother finally whispered, her voice barely audible, "please tell me this isn't true." Jessica's jaw clenched, her fingers twitching against the table, her breath coming in short, shallow bursts as she struggled to find the right response, the right lie, but there was nothing left for her to say. And then, just like that, the mask shattered. She shoved the phone away with a force that sent it sliding back toward me, her expression twisting into something ugly, something furious, something that no longer cared about maintaining an image of composure. "This is unbelievable," she snapped, pushing her chair back so roughly that it screeched against the hardwood floor. "You don't even know what you're talking about, Emily. You're just obsessed with tearing me down, because you can't stand that I'm better than you." I didn't flinch. "I'm not trying to tear you down," I said simply, watching as she trembled with anger, watching as our parents sat there in stunned silence, finally seeing her for who she really was. "I'm just letting everyone see the truth." For the first time in my life, I watched as my parents actually considered my words, actually saw me as something more than the bitter, jealous sibling Jessica had always painted me to be. I saw the way my mother's shoulders slumped in defeat, the way my father, the man who had spent years praising Jessica without hesitation, finally looked at her with something other than blind admiration. And Jessica saw it too. Her hands curled into fists at her sides, her eyes burning with rage as she looked between them, waiting, hoping for them to jump in, to save her, to defend her the way they always had. But they didn't. And that was all it took to break her completely. With a sharp, bitter laugh, she grabbed her purse from the back of the chair, shaking her head as she turned toward the door. "You all want to believe her over me?" she spat, her voice sharp, furious, dripping with resentment.
"Fine.
But don't come crawling back when you realize how wrong you are." No one stopped her as she stormed out, the door slamming behind her with a force that rattled the walls. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty seat she had left behind, letting the weight of the moment settle in, letting the years of being dismissed and ignored finally come to an end. And then, as I reached for my drink, as I took a slow sip of wine, as I let out a breath I hadn't realized I had been holding, my phone buzzed with a single new message. "Jessica, you think this is over? Watch your back." Months had passed since that night at the dinner table, months since Jessica's carefully constructed world had collapsed right in front of her, Months since I had finally watched my parents open their eyes and see her for what she really was. The aftermath had been exactly what I had expected. Jessica had disappeared for a while, licking her wounds, no doubt trying to rebuild whatever was left of the life she had so desperately tried to hold together. My parents, on the other hand, had finally started to change, or at least they were trying to. For the first time in my life, they actually made an effort with me, reaching out without making it seem like I was some kind of afterthought, asking about my job, my projects, my plans for the future. It was strange at first, hearing them talk about my career with genuine interest instead of using it as a footnote in a conversation that always circled back to Jessica. They didn't outright apologize, not in the way I might have hoped, but their actions said what their words never had. That they had been wrong, that they had spent too many years putting Jessica on a pedestal while overlooking everything I had worked for. And, honestly, that was enough. I had never needed their approval, not really, but knowing that they finally saw me as my own person, not just as Jessica's less impressive older sister, was more satisfying than I could have imagined. I thrived in those months, throwing myself into work, focusing on my own successes without the shadow of Jessica looming over me, finally enjoying the peace that came with not having to compete in a race I had never wanted to be part of. And then, just when I thought I had put it all behind me, she came back. It was a regular afternoon, nothing special, nothing unusual. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a project proposal, when the notification popped up on my screen. An email. From Jessica. For a long moment, I just stared at it, my hands motionless over the keyboard, my mind instantly running through 100 different possibilities for what she could possibly want. The subject line was simple, almost neutral, but the moment I opened it, I knew exactly what this was. Jessica was begging for help. The email was long, far longer than I would have expected from someone who had spent years looking down on me, treating me like I was somehow beneath her. She started off with small talk, an awkward attempt at pretending that things weren't still tense between us, but it wasn't long before she got to the real reason she had reached out. She was struggling. She couldn't find a job. Her reputation in the industry was damaged. The financial mess she had created had finally caught up with her, and now she was out of options. She had gone from luxury vacations and designer shopping sprees to struggling just to make rent, and now, after burning through every possible resource, she was turning to the one person she had spent years treating as an afterthought. She was asking me for a job. She knew that my company had recently expanded, knew that we were hiring, knew that I was in a position where I could easily pull a few strings if I wanted to. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't trying to prove she was better than me. She was asking me to save her. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the words on the screen, rereading them over and over, feeling something I couldn't quite describe settle in my chest. She hadn't apologized. Not once in the entire email had she acknowledged what she had done. Not once had she admitted to the lies, the manipulation, the way she had tried to tear me down every chance she got. There was no remorse, no ownership of her mistakes, just a carefully worded plea that was designed to make it seem like we were still sisters, like we were still close, like this was just a small favor between family. I could have responded. I could have written back, called her out on everything, forced her to say the words she had never been willing to say, made her acknowledge what she had done. I could have dangled the possibility of helping her just to watch her squirm, just to see if she was willing to grovel, just to see if she would finally admit that she had been wrong. But instead, I did the one thing I knew would hurt her the most. I closed the email, and I didn't reply. Because sometimes, the best revenge isn't destroying someone, it's letting them destroy themselves.